In the 12th century, an English entertainer named Roland Lepetour secured an unlikely retirement package from King Henry II himself, a grant of 30 acres of land. But there was a catch. The sole condition of this retirement plan was that every Christmas he returned to the court to perform one jump, one whistle, and most importantly, to break wind on command. He was known as Roland the Farter. It's not a mere footnote of absurd trivia, but it opens up a window into the curious world of medieval court jesters, and perhaps the royal sense of humor of this time. But these court jesters were far from being buffoons. Jesters in medieval Europe inhabited a very complex role. They could be, by turns, sharp-witted confidants to kings, battlefield provocateurs facing real peril, itinerant merrymakers wandering from castle to marketplace, or even pious, holy fools weaving divine madness into their antics. And so the role of the medieval jester came in many shapes. Some were consummate performers paid in gold, while others were innocents kept out of charity, or perhaps cruelty. And yet others donned cap and bells only during seasonal festivals. And so today, we are going to talk all about jesters throughout Europe in the Middle Ages, charting their origins, roles, and of course the many incarnations, from the king's clever confidant to the itinerant minstrel, all the way to that holy fool. And in the process, I think we'll uncover quite a few surprising facts and anecdotes that bring these forgotten entertainers to life. But first, allow me to welcome you to the channel. Introduction is certainly a little bit different to what we're used to on this channel, but I figured I'd best start with something that's going to get the attention of most people. I'm sure that it accomplished that aim. If you are new to the channel and you're yet to click that subscribe button, I invite you to do so, same as the like button, and leave your comments down in the comments section. Always helps push the video out, algorithms and such. And of course, like with all the other videos on this channel, you are enjoying it completely ad-free due to the generous contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, and those who checked out the merch store. If you are considering supporting the channel, you can find the means to do so in the pinned comment or in the description of the video. You'll find where you need to go. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get to our topic, the medieval jester. Let's start right from the beginning. But of course the beginning is a little hard to trace. You see, the idea of the court jester, it wasn't something that just sprung up overnight, but rather it evolved from earlier traditions of comedic and musical entertainers. Ancient antecedents set the stage for this. The comic actors and buffoons of imperial Rome, known as scure, mimi, or histriones, are often cited as precursors to the medieval jesters. In fact, the Latin term histrio, or actor, continued to be used in early medieval texts to describe these roaming performers. After the fall of Rome, entertainment did not vanish. Itinerant troubadours, gleemen, jongleurs roamed the land, singing songs and performing tricks. In the early Middle Ages, that is the 5th to the 10th centuries, rulers and chieftains in Europe kept households, bards, and jokers. In Celtic Ireland, for example, it's recorded that from remote times kings maintained fools, jesters, and jugglers at the court for amusement. These Irish jesters, druth in Gaelic, wore rather fantastical garb and cracked impudent jokes to lighten noble hearts, much as their successors would do in Norman castles centuries later. By the 11th and 12th centuries, terminology began to crystallize, and the role gained clearer definition. Notably, the Latin term joculator, from which the word juggler derives, by the way, and the Old French menestrel, from the Latin ministerialis, or little servant, came into use at this time, referring broadly to people who busied themselves entertaining others. In Norman England, minstrel denotes a wide range of performers at first: singers, storytellers, musicians, acrobats, jugglers, magicians, and also joculatores, or jesters. In medieval society, such performers occupied a very low rung of respectability. Just like in Roman times, the church often disapproved of their antics, and law codes sometimes stripped them of certain civil rights. Yet, they were undeniably in demand. The earliest medieval jesters were often simply talented minstrels with a flair for comic storytelling or a bit of physical comedy. And women could be jesters too. One record from 1086 even notes a female entertainer, Adeline the Joculatrix, who owned land in Hampshire, illustrating that both genders certainly took part in the profession. But it's in the 12th century that we first see the title Folus, or foal, the old word that we have for fool, appearing in documents as a designation for a court entertainer. The emergence of the word fool signified a slightly new concept: a dedicated comic servant attached to a noble household. Monarchs began to retain court fools in a formal capacity and sometimes rewarded them lavishly for loyalty and just livening the place up a bit. We've already told about Roland Pateur's story. That's one striking example. Here was a jester so valued, or at least so memorable, that he earned land in return for his yearly performance of flatulence. The fact that such a strange service was recorded in royal records hints that by Henry II's time, to remind you that is 12th century England, the king's fool was just an accepted part of court life. Meanwhile, on the continent, similar figures existed under names like menstruel in French, nar, which is German for fool, and buffone in Italian, of course, for buffoon. The high medieval period, 1200 to 1300, would see the court jester become a fixture in noble courts across Europe. But as we shall see, not all jesters were alike. So before examining the different types, let's consider first what daily life at court was like for these entertainers, and of course, what roles they actually played. We might imagine a jester perpetually capering at the king's feet, but in reality, medieval court jesters did not spend all day juggling or telling jokes. Feasts and special occasions were their time to shine, but the rest of their days could be rather ordinary. In fact, noblemen did not hold banquets or merrymaking every night, and hearing the same fool perform endlessly, well, that would grow tedious, wouldn't it? So, a resident jester often had other duties within the household. Some served as grooms, dog keepers, or messengers when not employed on stage, so to speak. Their official title might be the Lord's Fool, but they could be found helping procure food for the estate or accompanying their lord on travels. This dual existence, part esteemed entertainer, part servant, placed jesters in a unique insider but also outsider position at court. But when they did perform, jesters brought levity and wit into a stiff atmosphere of medieval aristocratic life. Like I said, the place certainly needed to be lightened up a bit. And that's exactly what they did. They lifted the mood at court with a repertoire that could include storytelling, singing witty ballads, reciting poems, or performing magic tricks and sleight of hand, along with a bit of juggling, acrobatics, and clever wordplay. A good jester could do it all, multi-talented. One 13th century traveler bitterly noted that no one gave him nice robes or gifts because, quote, he couldn't play instruments, tell jokes or stories, juggle or dance, or fart a tune, implying that a proper jester had to do all of these things at once. Many jesters also attuned their humor to current events. They would lampoon local scandals, or poke fun at notable guests in attendance, much to the amusement or perhaps embarrassment of those around. Surviving accounts show that jesters often made contemporary jokes about people or news known to their audience, making them something like medieval satirists, tailing roast-like commentary for the court. Crucially, jesters enjoyed a rather rare social license. They could speak truth to power, under the guise of folly. By tradition, a court fool's barbs were tolerated where anybody else's would be punished. And this gave rise to the famous idea that the jester is the only one who can ridicule the king without being, beheaded for doing so. But in practice, the fools did have to tread carefully, as we'll later see with one of them who pushed Henry VIII a little bit too far. We'll get to that later. But still, at least in medieval terms, many of them wielded a surprising amount of freedom of speech. Medieval kings occasionally used their fools as a sort of informal advisor or truth-teller, precisely because a fool could afford to voice unpleasant truths in a joking manner. The wise fool paradox, that the buffoon may utter wisdom masked as nonsense, appears frequently in literature and history. Shakespeare would later capture this dynamic in characters like King Lear's fool. But real medieval examples abound. A one-telling anecdote is King Edward II of England, as in the early 14th century. He was so accustomed to his fool's familiarity that he reportedly called every successive fool Robert, regardless of his actual name. Well, that suggests Edward and his son Edward III, who kept the practice, treated, quote, Robert the Fool, almost as a position or persona whose individual identity mattered quite a bit less than the actual role, a permanent fixture which allowed banter with the monarch. It also implies the fool had continuous access to the king, a trusted presence in his private circle. Apart from humor, jesters sometimes served practical functions in rather delicate situations. One was a buffer or bearer of bad news. If a monarch was likely to react badly to certain tidings, a clever fool might be asked to deliver the message in a more soft manner. Chronicles mention instances where fools broke news of military defeats or personal tragedies by couching them in jokes or allegories, hoping to reduce the sting. Of course, this was pretty risky. Success meant the king laughed and got the message, but failure could mean that the king, I suppose we could say, shoots the messenger, even if he is a jester, just trying to lighten the mood. And we do have a notable case. a fool of Philip VI of France, reportedly saved his own skin when asked to announce the English victory at Crecy in 1346. He snuck into the king's chambers at night, and in a sorrowful tone woke him up, saying, "Our English friends are sitting merrily at Crecy this evening." When the king bolted upright demanding an explanation, the fool quipped, "Why, sire, because they have beaten our army," delivering the bad news with a dose of irony that legend says made the furious king begrudgingly smile. Certainly risky, that's for sure. But anecdotes like this, whether they're apocryphal or not, they kind of illustrate a delicate diplomacy of humor that the jesters sometimes practiced. Still, it's a dangerous job to go and break that kind of news. Yet, we know that being the purveyor of pointed jokes can be perilous. While patronized by great lords, a jester was still a servant, and he could fall out of favor in an instant if a joke misfired. We know in our real lives that saying just one wrong thing can sour a relationship very quickly. The English Tudor king Henry VIII kept a beloved jester, Will Somers. He was a companion for many years, but even Will knew that there were some lines that you just could not cross. An observer noted that on one particularly volatile night, Henry, enraged and probably a few pints down, threatened to banish and execute all of the jesters, and not even Somers' usual charm could immediately calm him. Eventually, Somers had to risk telling the king that he needed laughter as much as anyone, daring to chide Henry for his gloom. Unfortunately, he came to his senses. Henry forgave him. But the other jesters were less lucky. We hear of a fool in Henry's court, perhaps an itinerant who intruded uninvited, who so irritated the king that Henry had him summarily beheaded on the spot. Clearly, walking a fine line between acceptable irreverence and fatal impudence was part of the jester's job description. Despite these tasks, successful court jesters could attain a measure of security and even prestige, pretty much unknown to any other class in medieval times. A valued jester enjoyed the protection of a powerful patron, a place at the high table, both literally and figuratively, and often generous rewards. Records show that English kings gave their fools gifts of clothing and even an allowance. One such entertainer, Tom the Fool, performed at the wedding feast of Princess Elizabeth, his daughter of Edward I of England around 1297, and he received a payment of 50 shillings for the reward. Now, to put that sum in perspective, a skilled laborer at the time earned only a few pence per day, so 50 shillings was a small fortune. Similarly, in France and the Burgundian court, talented jesters could become kind of minor celebrities. Some were given fine horses, their own servants, and even the best seat by the fire. A top jester might wield influence by virtue of his closeness to the ruler, causing other courtiers to curry favor with him, despite his technically lowly status. And so it is no wonder that one contemporary remarked that, quote, everyone wanted the top job of court fool, but few vacancies existed. The position was, in a sense, the pinnacle of the entertainment profession, a stable sinecure that many wandering minstrels dreamed of having. I suppose it's kind of like getting a residency at a casino in Las Vegas. Kind of like that. And so to sum it all up, this life of the court jester was a study in contrast. It combined periods of mundane servitude with moments of high-performance drama. It granted a license for candor, yet demanded constant discretion. It offered proximity to power, but zero formal power of its own. Jesters lived inside the royal household, but outside the royal hierarchy. They were both insiders and outsiders, as we can put it, uniquely able to mock the very world that sheltered them. And it's within this paradoxical status that the jester becomes such a fascinating social figure. And so next, we're going to talk about the different types of jesters, as not all of them who were in this profession were under the same circumstance. So as the Middle Ages progressed, the fool became an umbrella term, covering several distinct categories of entertainers and fools. Broadly, we can distinguish three types of medieval jester roles. The first is the professional court jester. These are the classic household jesters, intelligent, quick-witted performers, employed by kings or nobles on a long-term basis, often called licensed fools, because they had official sanction to jest freely. They were typically astute and often well-educated individuals. Contrary to popular images, the professional fool at court did not always dress in silly costumes. Many apparently wore ordinary attire, quite similar to their employers, especially in earlier medieval times before the gaudy jester suit became fashionable. The humor was highly verbal and situational. They were expected to cleverly amuse high-born audiences and also serve as conversational foils for their lords. This category includes the most famous named jesters in history, people like Triboulet, the French jester to King Francois I, Will Sommers, the jester to King Henry VIII of England, and Stanzik, the Polish jester, serving King Sigismund the Old. These professionals could become confidants of their rulers, and some even undertook semi-official tasks, such as delivering messages and even spying. Well, everyone needs a side hustle, don't they? They were paid wages, or given benefits, and if they pleased their lord, they might enjoy a considerable amount of comfort and protection. So the professional fool was in many ways a skilled courtier who used humor instead of diplomacy. A fool by job title, but quite often the sharpest mind in the room. Then we have the natural fool or innocent. Medieval elites at times kept men and women of mental disability or physical deformity as jesters, a practice that today is frankly quite cruel and exploitative, but, well, we can't hold medieval people by the modern standard, can't we? You see, in those times, such individuals were viewed as sources of spontaneous humor. Their unusual appearance and unconventional behavior made them objects of fascination. Noble families might adopt an innocent, someone who was, for instance, intellectually disabled, or perhaps a dwarf, to keep them around as almost like playthings, for their amusement, or perhaps as an act of Christian charity in the best cases. These unfortunates were the true fools in the original sense, that is, folly is a lack of reason. They generally did not receive salaries, but they were given food, simple clothing, sometimes the motley garb and cap with ears to accentuate their role, and also a place to sleep, often quite literally on the floor of the great hall. They held titles like the Duke's Fool or the Queen's Fool, indicating a possession by a lord. In some cases, keeping a natural fool was seen as an act of benevolence. Better a noble household than the harsh streets. But it was benevolence mixed with ridicule. Historic examples include Jane Fool, a female jester who served Queen Mary I of England. Some accounts suggest Jane might have been a woman with a learning disability whom the Tudor court found endearing and amusing. Natural fools sometimes provided comic relief, just by their spontaneous remarks or physical antics, without the need for a polished routine. They were somewhat pets of the court, and when they ceased to amuse, their fate could be quite sad. Some were pensioned off with a small allowance or sent to monasteries, but others were simply cast out to become beggars. Despite the often patronizing treatment they received, a few innocent fools were fondly remembered by their patrons. Their simplicity could sometimes thaw a monarch's hardened heart in ways that no adviser could. The distinction between professional and natural fools was recognized by contemporaries. One was an artificial fool, that is, a person who pretended to be foolish for a living but was wise. The other, a natural fool, a person who was perceived as genuinely lacking. Both, however, sat at the same royal tables in the eyes of the world, embodying the two sides of medieval folly. Well, third, we have the itinerant or festival fool. Not all medieval jesters were attached to households year-round. Many were wandering entertainers or amateurs who performed seasonally, especially during festivals. In cities of France and elsewhere, groups called fool societies emerged, bands of merrymakers who organized revels on holidays like Christmas, Twelfth Night, or Carnival. These were the people who most often donned that classic jester costume that we think of today. The multicolored tunics with jagged edges, the hood with donkey ears or a cockscomb crest, sometimes even bells attached that jingled as they moved, and perhaps a scepter-like mock staff which was called a bauble, often topped with a carved fool's head, essentially a mini jester doll. They pranced through the streets, leading parades of fools and carnivalesque procession. In the Feast of Fools, a medieval festival held around New Year's in some regions, lower clergy would elect a Lord of Misrule or a Bishop Fool to ape sacred ceremonies in a rather irreverent manner. These festival fools provided the public with comedic theater and ritualized chaos, mocking the serious routine of church and state. They could get away with it for just a day. While often not professionals by trade, many had real performance skills. We're talking music, acrobatics, things like this. The guilds of fools in places like 15th century France indicate that even civic comedy could be organized. These festival clowns essentially were the ancestors of modern clowns and circus performers. Unlike court fools, their audience was the general populace, and their humor could be even more satirical and biting, since it was part of an allowed social inversion. For instance, during Carnival in medieval Paris, members of the Law Clerks Guild dressed as fools and staged ludicrous trials of everyday figures, delivering judgment in nonsense rhythms, a way to blow off a bit of steam in a highly stratified society. Though tolerated during the holiday, such folly sometimes earned clerical condemnation. You can imagine the church, being famous for their sense of humor in medieval times, were never quite comfortable with the Feast of Fools, and by the 15th century it was largely suppressed for being too unruly. But nevertheless, the spectacle of costumed jesters dancing with bells remained a beloved image of medieval popular culture. We find them depicted in manuscripts, in woodcut prints, and later in paintings, the fool, with his flamboyant garb, becoming a symbol of mirth itself. In addition to these broad types, there were hybrids or other related figures. For example, some itinerant minstrels essentially functioned as freelance jesters, traveling from one noble's hall to another, offering their comic shows for a night's hospitality or a few coins. The lonely castle, or a roadside inn, might warmly welcome the visit of such a wandering fool whose jokes and stories broke the monotony of medieval life. And there were also dwarf jesters, overlapping with the innocent category, particularly favored in certain courts for their stature. The courts of late medieval Burgundy and Spain famously kept dwarfs as jesters and chamber fools. Their small size was often accentuated by miniature costumes. We even have accounts of child jesters kept by kings to grow up as fools. And on the other end, there were scholarly fools, like the versificator, the poet-fool in Henry III of England's court, who was essentially a learned man to compose witty verses and entertain the upper class. Of course, by the Middle Ages, these various fool figures began to intermingle with the emerging forms of popular theatre, and that's where we get lots of interesting characters coming out. We actually have plenty of notable jesters, and the little anecdotes that come with them across medieval Europe. The records and legends preserve the names of a few extraordinary characters, whose stories offer quite a bit of insight into the role. We already met Roland, forever famous or infamous for institutionalizing flatulence as royal entertainment. But let's journey through a sampling of other fools from different courts. First we have Rahere of England of the 12th century. Long before the heyday of Tudor jesters, King Henry I of England's court featured an amusing fellow named that Rahere. Described variously as a courtier, minstrel, jester, Rahere was a royal favorite, known for his wit. But his life took a remarkable turn. After a pilgrimage to Rome, where he survived illness, Rahere had a spiritual conversion. He founded St. Bartholomew's Priory and Hospital in London in 1123 and became its first prior. So you imagine that. A former jester becoming a man of God and establishing a hospital. Rahere's story, perhaps part fact and part legend, shows that the boundary between the clown and the cleric could sometimes blur. In fact, his tomb can still be seen at St. Bartholomew the Great in London, a lasting monument to the jester turned monk. It suggests that jesters, while devoted to mirth, were of course not devoid of a deeper calling or character. Well, let's have a look at Burgundy in the late 15th century, where we find Jehan le Glorieux, known by the nickname meaning the proud or the glorious one. Le Glorieux was the jester of Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy. Charles was a stern and humorless prince, so the antics of his jester stood out all the more. Le Glorieux's real name was said to be Nicolas Ferial, and he was a hunchbacked dwarf, a classic case of that physical innocent, but he was also quite quick-tongued. One anecdote relates that after Charles' death in battle in 1477, Le Glorieux was found wandering the ducal castle weeping. Someone remarked that he should be happy now, as fools thrive in times of chaos. But the jester retorted, quote, "I weep because now there is no fool in Burgundy. The one fool that ruled us all is dead. By calling the famously rash Duke the true fool, even in death, Leglorio delivered a poignant final jest, and so his legacy lives on in literature and folklore, representing a sharp-tongued fool who cleverly critiqued his master's failings, albeit quite conveniently waiting until his master has died and has no means of retort to say such things. But then we have unusual for the time, being 16th century England. The court of Queen Mary I Tudor included a female jester known as Jane the Fool. Jane had also served Mary's stepmother, Queen Catherine Parr, and possibly Princess Elizabeth, often depicted in accounts as wearing a simple russet gown and a cloth cap. Jane Fool likely fell into the innocent category of fools, a gentlewoman with some developmental disability who became a beloved mascot of the royal household. Mary I was an embattled, melancholic queen, and it's touching to note, I suppose, that she kept Jane close by, perhaps for comfort, more of a friend than anything. In one story, during a tense moment, Mary's advisers urged her to sign the death warrant of a traitor. Jane reportedly broke the grim atmosphere by snatching up a nearby document and mimicking the serious counselors, causing Mary to laugh and delay her decision. Though largely voiceless in historical record, Jane's presence hints at the often unsung emotional support that a jester could provide just by their simple, unaffected companionship. Let's go to France now, early 16th century, where we find arguably one of the most legendary court jesters. Triboulet, born Nicolas Ferrial, just by coincidence the same name as Leglorio, but unrelated. He served Kings Louis XII and Francois I. Triboulet was a true professional jester, highly intelligent, but physically deformed. He had a big hump on his back. He was fearless in mocking those who were above him in hierarchy. It is said that he once slapped King Francois on the behind in a fit of clownery, which apparently Francois did not see the humor in. He threatened Triboulet with execution for his impertinence, allowing him to choose the manner of his death. But quick as a flash, the jester replied, "Good sire, by Saint Goody Two-Shoes rather, and Saint No-Nose, I choose to die from old age." The king had apparently burst out laughing and came to his senses and spared him. This famous anecdote, whether it's real or not, it sure shows the razor-sharp wit that a jester needed to survive his own jokes, and has certainly some poise under pressure in that moment. In fact, Triboulet's name became synonymous with mischievous jokers in French culture. Even Victor Hugo wrote a play that was partly inspired by him. Beyond the jokes, Triboulet also, according to law, saved Francois's life by warning him of a plot, proving that a fool could indeed be both jester and protector. He is remembered as a master of his craft, one whose tongue was as swift as the bauble. Let's go to Poland now. The Polish court of King Sigismund I, also known as the Old, who had a jester named Stanzik, who was revered in Poland as a symbol of wise patriotism hidden in a jester's garb. Stanzik's fame came largely from anecdotes written in later recollections. The most famous story goes like this. In 1514, while the court was merrily indulging in a hunt, news arrived that the important fortress of Smolensk had fallen to the Grand Duchy of Moscow. All the nobles were distraught at this political and military disaster, except for Stanzik, who had been quite morose before the news, and remarked that he was glad. Asked why, he supposedly had said, quote, "I've been worrying for weeks now that our country was in peril, while you all chased a hare. Now that what I feared has happened, at least I'm not the only one troubled. The whole court shares my worry." In another version, he quips that the courtiers showed more distress at a lost hunt than at a lost realm. Either way, he seems to have used irony to shame the king and nobles for their misplaced priorities. He was known for such political satire. A jester, sure, but one whose barbs carried patriotic weight. The Polish painter Jan Matejko famously depicted Stanzik in a painting, hanging his head in thought while a ball goes on behind him. That has cemented the jester's image as a lone truth-teller amid the oblivious elites. It is a legacy that shows that a respect a jester could earn posthumously. He is regarded as something as a folk hero in Poland. At least, that's what Reddit told me when I looked him up. Perhaps so. Either way, he is the embodiment of that idea that sometimes the jester is actually the wisest in the room. One of the earliest medieval jesters, or rather minstrel jesters, to enter the chronicles is Taillefer, a performer in Duke William of Normandy's retinue. Though not a court fool in peacetime, Taillefer achieved legendary status for his actions at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. As the story is told, just before the armies clashed, Taillefer rode out in front of the Norman lines on horseback. He began to juggle his sword and sing the Song of Roland at the top of his lungs, taunting the Anglo-Saxons. An English soldier rushed forth to silence him, and Taillefer struck the man down, only to be swarmed and killed in turn. Thus, having the grim achievement of being the first casualty of Hastings. His performance, however, had whipped the Normans into a fighting frenzy, and supposedly unnerved parts of the English line. Now, whether that's true or not, it certainly preserves the jester as a warrior/entertainer, using showmanship and daring to inspire the troops. In fact, Taillefer's name means iron cutter, befitting a minstrel unafraid to draw the sword. Well, we have now Chicot of France in the late 16th century. Though a bit beyond the medieval period, we're still going to mention it, as he represents the last flourish of that jester tradition in France. He served King Henry III and later King Henry IV. He was not called a fool officially, he was rather a nobleman who had a caustically witty persona, essentially acting as an unofficial jester. He accompanied Henry III on military campaigns, and reportedly once carried out a diplomatic mission to Navarre in his jester-like capacity, using humor to convey messages. Chicot would openly call Henry III Monsieur d'Anjou, a title the king bore before the throne, in a mocking tone, and even interrupt royal council meetings with sarcastic remarks. Because of his valuable counsel hidden in jest, Henry tolerated these breaches of decorum. In one instance, when the king was indulging in his notorious vices, Chicot probably prayed, "Lord, have mercy on this laughing stock of the world, our king," causing both shock and sober reflection at court. Now that boldness shows how, even as late as 1600, the idea of the jester speaking hard truths lived on. But he eventually met a tragic end, killed in a scuffle. and with him his contemporaries. The era of the court jester in the classic sense had largely faded away. Of course, we could add many more names, from Archibald Armstrong, the wisecracker of King James VI and First's court in Scotland and England, who got himself banished for insulting too many lords, to the fools of the Spanish Habsburgs, of course. King Philip III had a beloved dwarf jester named El Bobo de Coria, who could barely speak, but made the king laugh just with his body language. Across the Holy Roman Empire, Italian city-states and elsewhere, similar characters flit in and out of the records, sometimes appearing in payment rolls, sometimes in anecdotes. One Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I, kept a famous jester named Kunz von der Rosen, who later became legendary for his pranks at court in Vienna and Innsbruck. He once placed live beetles inside the ceremonial wreaths intended for ladies at a tournament. The insects seemed to have crawled out at an inopportune moment, and pandemonium ensued, and Maximilian roared with laughter while the pretentious courtiers fumed. Stories like this show the important aspect of the jester's art, that ability to undercut pomposity and bring the mighty low, if only just for a moment, in a sense an equalizing force wrapped up in simple entertainment. Of course, having fun is all good and well, but is there somebody you forgot to ask? What did the church think about all this? Well, let's ask them, shall we? Medieval jesters not only straddled social classes, but they also straddled that line between the profane and sacred. The relationship between jesters and the church was ambivalent. On one hand, the clergy frequently denounced fools and minstrels as sinful. Medieval sermons and writings refer to them as frivolous, even diabolic figures leading people into temptation. There were church laws forbidding clergymen from playing the fool, or even associating with them. At times, they were even denied Christian burial, and monastic chroniclers often painted them as rogues. We're going back pretty early now. The Council of Trullo in 691, and later local synods, included canons against theatrical and comic entertainers. In the Sencus Mor, that is Old Irish law, as we say, jesters and gleemen were considered to be dishonorable. But that being said, medieval Christianity also had a place, albeit a controversial one, for foolishness in a spiritual key. This was the concept of the holy fool that we've mentioned, a person who feigns madness or embraces humiliating eccentricity, all for the sake of Christ. It drew on the apostolic idea, voiced by St. Paul, of being a fool for Christ's sake. 1 Corinthians 4:10, by the way, if you want to look that up. In Western Europe, the most famous example is St. Francis of Assisi. Now, do not get me wrong, Francis was not a court jester, but he consciously adopted the persona of joyful simplicity that he likened to being God's troubadour. He and his followers joyfully called themselves jugglers or jesters of God. This startling term, used by a saint who rejected wealth and status, flipped the cultural script somewhat. The lowly entertainer became a model for humility and divine joy. Francis's approach was just that: as a jester seeks to make an earthly lord's laugh, he would bring the joy to the kingdom of heaven by his life and praise of service. Thus, even as secular jesters were condemned by preaching friars, one of the greatest friars of all time was embracing a kind of holy folly. This exemplifies the complex medieval attitude towards it. Folly in the world was vanity, but folly for God could be a kind of sanctity. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Urodivi, or holy fools, became an accepted and even revered phenomenon. These were individuals who behaved as if insane, going naked, acting erratically, to provoke repentance and humility in others. Notably, some holy fools had interactions with rulers reminiscent of Jesters' interactions with kings. The Russian Tsars of Moscow sometimes kept holy fools nearby, or at least tolerated their blunt admonishments as coming from God. One striking figure is St. Basil the Blessed, 1468 to 1552 of Moscow, after whom the famous cathedral is actually named, by the way, St. Basil's. He was a naked beggar saint, known to startle people all of a sudden with oddly insightful actions. He publicly rebuked Tsar Ivan the Terrible for not paying attention in church, even as others dared not to say a word. Ivan, a ruler famous for his violent outbursts, not only spared Basil, but he actually rewarded him. Considering Basil holy despite his shocking frankness. And this mirrors the way a monarch might indulge a jester's barbs, with the difference that Basil's authority was a spiritual one. In 1570, another holy fool confronted Ivan when the Tsar was about to sack the city of Pskov. According to accounts, the fool offered Ivan raw meat, though it was Lent at the time, and chastised him for his bloodthirst, telling him essentially that since he was going to slaughter humans, a greater sin, that he may as well just break the fast as well. Ivan was reportedly shamed, and because of this, cancelled the massacre. Meanwhile, within the ritual life of the medieval church, there were moments when the walls between solemnity and, well, silliness frankly came down. The Feast of Fools mentioned earlier was a festival where junior clergy parodied their superiors. It was one such safety valve. On or around the Feast of the Circumcision, that is, January the 1st, in certain cathedrals in France and England, a boy bishop might be elected or a lord of misrule enthroned, and the clergy would wear absurd costumes, make animal noises in church, and just make fun of the Mass. One contemporary account from Notre Dame in Paris from the early 15th century shows how the subdeacons dressed as jesters and danced in the nave and sung ludicrous songs. The church hierarchy officially disproved. The Faculty of Theology in Paris issued condemnations of the feast in the 1440s, yet the practice continued among the people because it was wildly popular. It shows that the medieval sense of humor even penetrated this sacred sphere, if only temporarily. The world was, for a day, turned upside down. The highest became the lowest, the fool became the pope, and laughter was the most important thing. Interestingly, by the late Middle Ages, even theologians and moralists began to see value in this moderated practice. The influential scholar Desiderius Erasmus, writing in 1509, just after the medieval period, penned the work The Praise of Folly, an essay ironically eulogizing folly as a goddess who, though ridiculed, actually makes human life bearable and exposes the hypocrisy of it all. Erasmus was no fan of coarse jesters, but his work, satirically written The Voice of Folly, rehabilitates the concept of foolishness as something that can reveal deeper wisdom. He was likely influenced by that long tradition of the wise fool in scripture and literature. Similarly, Sebastian Brandt's Ship of Fools in 1494, a satirical allegory, used the image of fools aboard a ship to humorously critique the vices of his society. The book became a bestseller of its time, and spawned many imitations, suggesting that Europeans were ready to laugh at themselves through the mirror held up by the jester. And so, to sum it all up, the Church's stance evolved from blanket condemnation of frivolity to a more nuanced understanding that jesters could serve a purpose, whether as scapegoats for collective laughter or as unintentional prophets, speaking with the guilelessness of children. The medieval jester, though a secular figure, was part of this broader conversion about folly and wisdom, and some, like Francis or Basil, turned the tables entirely by making holiness out of foolery. As one medieval proverb put it, sometimes a fool may point at a truth which the wise blind themselves to. Well, by around 1600, the traditional court jester was beginning to vanish from the halls of power. The Elizabethan era in England still had a few celebrated fools. In fact, there was one household entertainer named Richard Tarleton, a stage clown employed by Elizabeth, also dubbed as a semi-official jester, and James I later employed one Archibald Armstrong. But increasingly the role of the fool shifted to the theatre and the marketplace. Troops of actors incorporated clown characters into their plays. Entrepreneurs organized traveling circuses and fair shows where jesters performed for public crowds. And the rise of professional theatres, like the Globe in London, meant that wit and satire found a new home on the stage, rather than at court dinner tables. Now, Shakespeare, in particular, immortalized the archetype of the jester in his literature. Characters like Fest in the Twelfth Night, or the fool in King Lear who mixed levity with poignant insight. Another quote from Fest, actually. Foolery, sir, does not walk about the orb like the sun, it shines everywhere. These literary fools were often inspired by real predecessors and the actors who played them. Shakespeare wrote many of his clown roles for Robert Armin, a performer and author who had studied actual court fools, and he even wrote a book about them. Back in continental Europe, the Baroque courts of the 17th century grew to be quite more formal and less tolerant of the chaos that a jester could bring. Absolute monarchs like Louis XV preferred scripted entertainments, ballets, operas, over the unpredictable rifling of a court fool. The last vestiges lingered. For example, the Habsburg rulers of Spain in the 17th century famously kept dwarf jesters and naturals at court, whom the great painter Velázquez portrayed with empathy and nuance in his court portraits. These individuals, like Don Sebastián de Mora or Francisco Lescano, El Niño de Vallecas, were more companions than comedians to the Spanish royals, and, well, by the 1700s, even that tradition had died out. Russia's Peter the Great, in the early 18th century, did revive the idea of a court fool in a bizarre way. He had a prince of fools preside over a mock court of jesters and drunks as part of his social satire of the old nobility. But this was more of an elaborate practical joke than a continuation of the actual medieval custom. However, if the flesh and blood jester departed the courts, the spirit of the jester lived on in culture and memory. The carnival clowns, the harlequins and pierrots of the Commedia dell'arte, and later circus clowns, they all owe a debt to the medieval fool's motley attire. Even in politics and media today, we often see this kind of licensed clown figure, the comedian who satirizes leaders on late-night shows, the political cartoonist exaggerating a statesman into a fool, or the court jester's modern descendant, the advisor who plays devil's advocate with a touch of humor to help keep a CEO or president in a better perspective. Think about it a lot of the time when they have these political discussions about certain things, whether it's an economical matter or something. They usually have 4 people on to talk. They'll always put one person in who offers a kind of lighter perspective, kind of brighten the mood a little bit. Once again, the tradition continues. Well, lastly, we should note that our modern depiction of the jester, the bright motley costume with the 3-pointed bell-tip hat, is a bit of a romanticized composite drawn from art across different eras. The medieval jesters probably looked much less uniform than that. A 14th century fool might just wear his everyday tunic, or at most a special hood with ears. It was during the Renaissance and Victorian eras that artists popularized the image of the jester as a stylized character. But nonetheless, that image accurately conveys the essence, a vivid, carnivalesque presence amid drab courtiers. Well, the fool, by visually standing apart, mocked the vanity of dressing above one's own station. Yet, in their own way, they were much a part of the pageantry of court life, as the crown and the throne were. After all, it's all just a big joke anyway. Well, with that being said, I think we've reached the end of today's video. Bit of a different kind of topic. It's important to talk about the lighter aspects of the medieval period. I know we all like hearing about the wars and the plagues and the atrocities, but, well, perhaps today I'm the one who brings some levity to the period. Anyway, let me thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. You got no ads because of these people, so it's all very much appreciated. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Rupert Nia, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Tavre, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Guku Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, and Neftis. Thank you all so much. Really do appreciate it. Now, guess what this sound is? It's the sound of me taking my coffee cup off the table and walking to the kitchen. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Once again, it's been a pleasure. And as always, lots of love to you all around the world, wherever you might be. Good night, and see you next time.